So it's been a couple of months since I've posted anything. That's mostly because the Christmas period for me is just so busy with trying to get prints out and dealing with orders. So I've had to put things back. I figured we would start off the new year with looking at a tool in Lightroom, and one that I think is well worth learning, especially if you're just getting into editing and photography, and that is the Curves tool. So why the Curves tool? Well, because it's a very versatile tool and you can get a lot of different things out of it, and you can also use it to fix certain things in your photo as well. And it's worth getting to know actually what is happening when you're making all these points, because we have a lot of options. If we scroll down here and look at our tone curve, we have these 4 different options going all the way across. So what do each of them do? What is the purpose of them? How can we use them? So stick around if this is going to be interesting for you, and let's dive into the tone curve. So first of all, at the top, we've got the parametric curve, we have the point curve, and then we have 3 separate channels as well. Now, in order to kind of demonstrate how this is going to work, I've brought up a gradient for us, and I very much recommend using gradients when you're getting to know these tools in Lightroom, because you can really see how it's affecting like our light spectrum here. What's adding color, what's shifting information. The other one to pay attention to is the histogram at the top. So what can we use the tone curve for? Well, we can really use it to control our contrast a lot more, and we can use it to introduce color into our image, kind of similar to a color gradient. But when we go onto our mask options and we create, let's just say, a brush mask here, you'll notice we also have the curves down here, so we can use it as well to make local adjustments to our image. So let's drop back across, and the first thing I want to do is just lift this contrast tool, and let's have a look at what happens to our gradient and the histogram as we raise this. See, as I raise my contrast to 100, we end up with more blacks this side and more whites this side, and that grey area reduces. If I go across to the other side at 100%, you'll see that grey area widen out. Now pay attention to the histogram at the top. See how we kind of crush the information to the sides there. We push blacks more towards blacks, we push whites more towards whites. Coming down into the tone curve, I'm going to move over to the point curve here, and all you can do is just click on there and select there, and that will enable you to move points. A couple of tricks for you: you can right click on this and you can delete control points that you've put in as well. Likewise, this is very, very sensitive, especially when we get onto the color channel. So if you hold down Option, as you pull, this will actually slow your movements down as well. So let's just remove that. Now, I'm going to put in 2 points up this end and 1 in the middle to show how we can control these different areas. And this is the most common way of using this, is an S curve. It's a great way for introducing more contrast into your image. So if I pull down on this side here and I lift up into this side, you can see that we're starting to get that same histogram shape and look in the middle here. So by lifting this end up into our whites and this end into our blacks, we are introducing contrast. But how is this working? Well, it's understanding where the different segments lie. So if I remove all these control points again, and I grab this side here and I slowly pull it up, notice how our blacks are disappearing into the grays. And if I pull that all the way up to the top here, we have a solid white image. Likewise, if I go over to this side, this is going to be your whitest point. And if I drag this down, look in the histogram and see how we are altering all of this information here. We're moving it across towards the blacks. And as I come right the way down, I lose all my data and push everything into the blacks here. Now, hovering over the histogram at the top, you'll see we have our blacks, our shadows, one called exposure, highlights, and whites here. Exposure we can also treat as the mids. Now, if I pull this back to normal and we think about if we want to affect our whitest point, this would be more towards the top here. So if I make a control point, you can see how that influences up at the top, but it's also influencing the entire histogram. So if I put another point in to help control that, I can make as many of these as I want, and I can control just the highest white areas or the highlight areas. I could put one down here to control our shadows, and maybe another one all the way down at the bottom here which controls more of our blacks. And this is a great tool because you can go quite crazy with it, really. And there'll be people out there that say, no, don't do it this way, or you should do it that way. But ultimately, this tool is great for fixing issues. It's great for matching stuff in Photoshop as well. But understanding why you'd be putting points in the first place is what's crucial to your edit. So you want to approach this tool with something in mind. Are you looking to introduce more contrast? Are you wanting to bring color, or are you wanting to control your light a lot more? So let's look at the light side. Now, as we get rid of all of these and go back to our gradient that we had here, you'll notice in the middle it says exposure. When we pull the exposure slider up, that's really what's happening, is it's affecting everything, but we can treat it as a midtone. So if you've got a photo that's dark and we make a point in the middle and pull up, we can actually brighten our image and introduce a bit more light without really hitting those whites and highlights a bit more. If I pull down the other way, I can actually darken my image. And this isn't necessarily introducing contrast, but the midpoints around here can really help control some of the light in your image. So let's look at an example of using this in a church. Now, I've already done an edit and I've used one of my presets on this. And now's probably a great time to say, if you are enjoying this and you like this kind of style of edits, please do check out my presets. You can get in the link below. And if you use the code YouTube10, you will get an additional $10 off of my complete set as well, which is, I don't even know how many presets now, about 160 something presets. So check that out below. But this one's using one of the dark academia ones, which works well in churches. But you can see in doing this, we've actually lost some of that contrast a bit more. So let's use the tone curve here to make that S curve and introduce some contrast. But also we're going to have a look at using that midpoint for the lights. So I'm going to make my 3 points. And if I pull down this side, you can see how we can actually darken down some of those areas with the blacks there. But then maybe I'm going to come up here and I'm going to widen that area. I'm going to put an additional control point in just to darken down and control those blackest moments. But you see, I could actually lift our blacks down here and find a nice balance of something that I like. So you can make as many as you want on this, and I've seen people put just dozens along this line before. And if I toggle this on and off with my arrow here, you can see we've brought in a bit more darkness and introduced some more contrast, particularly if we pull this down. Now if I grab my midpoint, and let's say we wanted a bit more light in those areas and push towards the white, see how I can introduce that there. Or I can pull down and this actually softens it a bit because we're reducing some of that light in the image. So the midtones is a really powerful one depending on what you're after. Pulling it up here in this scenario can give me more contrast, or I can reduce the contrast and the light in the image. But see, if I go too far, we start to get a washed out look. So you still want this to look natural there. So I'm gonna dip it slightly. Now, if you want to get the cinematic faded option, come right the way to these endpoints, and you saw as we lifted our blacks up before on that gradient, it became more of a white. So to get the faded look, you don't want your blacks or your whites to necessarily be true. So if I grab that endpoint and I lift it up, see how we start to get a faded look on this? And maybe I'll just control that point even more, and now I can get a bit more of a faded style. But again, go too far and it starts to look unnatural. This will differ depending on photos. Again, if I want to take my whites and pull that down, I can get more of a cinematic look to this. If I toggle on and off, you can see this has made a big difference. We've introduced almost like a cinematic flair to the image whilst controlling that light a little bit more. So now for a bit more extreme sample, we'll look at what I've done in the edit on this one here. Now I've actually done a couple of different things, but if we look at the point curve first of all, I turn it on and off, see how this photo beforehand was actually quite bright and I wanted to make it a bit more moody. Now I do have some masking in place as well here, but if I just toggle it on and off, the curve is really helping, not necessarily to introduce contrast, but it's helping us to darken down the image. And this is quite a steep curve, but that midpoint we've pulled down a lot just to help give a nice soft feeling to it. If I come over to the parametric curve here then, now I very gently just introduced a bit of shadows, but if I was to pull this down and up, see how it's affecting just one area of the image there. So kind of like what we have up here with our highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. The parametric curve we can still use to sort of bring up and down in these predetermined areas. But personally, I only use this as like a little top up for something that I was maybe a bit too scared to do in the point curve here. And the last one that we've introduced then is on this blue channel. So let's jump back over to our gradient and check out what's happening in these channels. So if I make, again, sort of my S curve here, so we can split up our shadows and blacks to our highlights and whites and our mids in the middle. And let's introduce a bit of blue up in here. So you see what happens is it's bringing in some of that blue into our shadow area. And if I dip down on this side into the yellows, we're introducing some yellows in here as well. Now the great thing again is it works just like the point curve, so you can kind of move this around. You see as I move back and forward here and dip down into the yellows, we get more of that mids in the yellows, and dip up, we get more of the blues. So you can use this to introduce a little bit of extra color, but just a warning, it is very, very delicate. If I come back over to this image that we had where there's a slight bit of blue in, and I just move up even further, see how that makes a drastic change to our image quite quickly. So this is where holding down your option can come in handy, and that will slow that point down, and you can make more determined moves of it, because you still want this to look fairly natural. So I'm just going to right click and reset this channel then, and go back over onto my point curve, and just to make things a little bit easier so we can see it, I'm going to reduce our whites and blacks, fade them out for that cinematic look so we can see a bit more of that color coming across the gradient. One great way you can use this is to introduce some color, but also additional contrast. If you're finding, again, you don't want to come up here and move the slider, you want more contrast in your image. So perhaps you've had to use the tone curve to control your light a bit more, but you still want to bring some of that contrast in. Now I do this quite a lot with my cinematic presets, and I'll show you a couple of examples in a moment. But if I come over here and I just simply do a little drag down at the bottom there, and a little drag up. Now that introduces some color and can look just terrible, but I can right click and go to copy channel settings. And then I can go across to my green channel and I can paste, and I can go across to my blue channel and paste. And look what's happened there. We have now lost all of the color that we've introduced, but we would have gained a bit of contrast. And if I slightly move one of these up or one of these down, it actually gives us a little bit of a greater control over all the channels there. So this is a trick that I see a lot of people do, because it does help you introduce that bit more contrast. But when you're doing it, I would do the copy and paste across your channels first, and then choose where you want to maybe bring in a bit more color. Again, these are very small movements. So if I reset this channel and I toggle on and off, now remember, we've got no point curve here, we've just got our 3 individual color channels, but you'll see it has introduced that contrast again, in that our blacks and our whites, we have them spread out. But then I maybe come over here and say, well, I want a bit more blues in my whites. It's a bit more subtle. Let's look at this on an image though. So on this image here, if I turn the tone curve on and off, what I'm using it to do is actually to darken down the image a bit more in an area that I want to control. So what I've done is to reduce some of the light on it by pulling down those midtones. So turning this on and off, you can see it's a bit darker. I've also lifted this here because I want it faded, but I've not at the top because I still want that white sky to be quite white. Then across the channels, I've got the same curve going in each time here. And the reason for this is to introduce some extra contrast into the image. So turning it on and off, we get a little bit more contrast, but again, I can control it. Now say I quite like either a blue wash or green wash to go on here. I could come into any of these channels and I could say, okay, well in my highlights, I'm just gonna bump this up slightly, and you can see you get a bit of a green wash. Now, in doing that, I'm not keen on it, but I like the idea of some more warms in the highlights. So in that case, I might come over to the yellow channel here and just dip this down slightly. And because I like some more cools maybe, I might just pull this one up. You can see how that very small change just brings a bit more blue in and a little bit more yellow in. Turn that on and off, and that's quite a nice look as well. But I preferred my original edit, so Command Z, and just put that back to normal. The point is, this is a very versatile tool, and hopefully by us just going through that, you can see some of the different options that you might want to use on these global edits. So think to yourself when approaching this, don't just go for the standard S tool. If there's nothing you can quite fix up here in the basic edit panel, this is giving you a lot of control over how you want to introduce that contrast, or some additional colors as well. Final thing to show you is how we might be able to use this locally then. So if I go over to the masking on this photo, which is one from Signature Edits, we can get loads of raw photos from there to practice on, so check them out. And this is using one of my presets, the black tone. And if we go onto here, then it's come across quite well, and I do like this preset, but it's got a lot of contrast in this preset, which works well with things like clothes in the background. The hair's quite nice, but the skin can sometimes have those flares on it. So how do we get rid of those white spots? Well, this is an area where we could bring in our curves tool to control that one little area. So if I go into here, subject, it's already found the people for me, so let's choose this person, and we'll just go for the facial skin, and we'll create a mask. Now I'm going to scroll down into my point curve here, and I'm just going to make a point there. But what I want to do is have a look at, if I drag this white bit down, watch what it does to those hot spots on the face. See how it will soften and reduce them, because remember, we're taking the whitest, the brightest points, and we're pulling it away from like a true white all the way down towards the black level. Because we've made a mask, we're not affecting anywhere else in the image. So this is a great way on some of those more contrasty edits or presets you use to just soften the faces a bit more. We could go to the other side as well, just to show for an example. If I lift that, you can see it makes some more of those like shadow areas. Probably wouldn't do it there, because you see if you go too far, but just to really show you an example, probably a bit overboard of what I would do, I might just lift that, bring a bit more like light into the face, and then probably make another control point and just find the right spot to lean down on that. And if we turn that on and off, you can see how we've now actually just softened the face out slightly there. Now you might think, well, problem is in doing that we might have lost a bit of color, so we could also still go across onto these channels, and if we take those highlights area, I could put a point in, use option, slow down, and I could see if I could bring some more yellow or some more war tones into the face there, again without going too overboard. So yes, by doing some of these fixes, remember, if you're reducing contrast like that, we might be sucking out some of the saturation and color. But this is where we can use those channels to help pull them back in. So if I turn my mask on and off, we've controlled some of that harshness on the face. We've still got the nice preset, but we've softened down some of the features. Now this is me going a little bit extreme so you can really see the effect, but obviously each to their own, edit it how you would like. So I hope that's been a really useful video for you, just to get to know the tone curve a bit more and really why you should be using it and how you could use it in some examples. Let me know in the comments below, like what's some ways that you use the tone curve quite regularly for, or if there's something you're going to try on in the future. This links in with a video that I'm going to be putting up soon, which is about using the color grading, as we've mentioned some color channels here. So what we've learned here will link across to that as well. Remember that you can check out all my presets down in the link below, subscribe, all of that stuff, and I will see you in the next one.